Extend my remark.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak out against the ongoing epidemic of gun violence in our cities and towns. There is no gun violence without guns. From the countless calls I've received from my constituents to the majority of Americans who have voiced their support for gun control reform, something must be done by Congress. So many Americans are haunted by the gun violence that has taken their loved ones, and that is why we should all be in favor of stronger gun laws to keep these weapons out of dangerous hands. Too many lives have been stolen. Too many children have been killed. For this reason, I will be introducing the Safer Neighborhoods Gun Buyback Act of 2023. My bill would provide federal grants to states and local governments and gun dealers to conduct gun buyback programs across the country. We need a national program to give all towns and cities the funds to get guns off of the streets. This is a common sense legislation and is, if no made into public
Gentleman's
law,
time is expired.
it would benefit our nation greatly.
Gentleman's time is expired.
I will yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, 15 months ago, I spoke here on the Senate floor to commemorate the victims of a shooting at Oxford High School in Oxford, Michigan. And Mr. President, just over 2 weeks ago, as a gunman opened fire at Michigan State University, our state lived through yet another nightmare. Another routine evening turned tragic. Another community was left scarred by unimaginable gun violence. And another 3 families will never see their children come home. Just after 8 p.m. on a crisp Monday evening, gunfire erupted at MSU's Berkey Hall. And as the alerts poured in, students all across campus huddled in fear. Some blockaded their dorm rooms and turned off the lights. Others grabbed whatever objects were nearby in case they needed to fight back. Parents called their children to check in if they were safe and worried if it could be the last time that they spoke. Those near the gunmen hid under tables and ran for their lives. One student said it sounded like a stampede as they tried to escape. In the end, 3 of their classmates did not make it. 3 students who had their entire lives ahead of them were stripped of their futures in an instant. Ariel Anderson, a 19-year-old from Harper Woods, was a sophomore. She enjoyed roller skating, photography, and live concerts. A committed student, she was working to graduate early and embark on a career as a pediatrician. She had a fierce intellect and a deep love for her family, touching everyone in her life with a kind and gentle spirit. Alex Werner was 20 years old. She was a junior from Clawson and was studying to become a forensic scientist. She was a gifted student athlete in high school, excelling in softball and basketball and volleyball, and a dedicated member of her community. Friends and teachers described her as a leader and a giver, someone who was always smiling. And one of her peers remembered that she was, quote, the very best of us. Brian Frazier, the 20-year-old sophomore from Grosse Pointe, had an infectious smile and a sense of humor that could brighten an entire room. As president of Phi Delta Theta fraternity, he demonstrated a commitment to service and to leadership. He had been studying business and economics when his life was cut short. As a father and a fellow Spartan, my heart breaks for these gifted students, for their families and friends, and the time that was stolen from them. My heart breaks for those who survived, who will carry the weight of this horrific memory for years to come. And while this scene unfolded, first responders and law enforcement officials bravely leaped into action. Dedicated doctors and nurses have worked around the clock to help the 5 students who were critically injured. And I'm grateful to these men and women for their tireless work. At the same time, I know that the students and staff at MSU and the broader East Lansing community will need time. They will need time to heal in the wake of this tragedy. But they shouldn't have to do that work alone. We can honor them by taking meaningful action, and we must do that now. Last year, Congress showed that common sense reform is still possible with the passage of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the most significant legislation to address gun violence in nearly 3 decades. It invests in mental health resources, expands school safety measures, enhances background checks, and includes new guidelines to make sure we keep guns from getting into the wrong hands. And while it's clear that this law did not go far enough, it has begun to make critical changes. We are already starting to see its benefits reach my state. Last week, Senator Stabenow and I welcomed $8 million in federal funding to the Michigan State Police. This investment will help combat drug violence and enhance crisis intervention programs all across the state of Michigan. But there's so much more that we can and we must do. We must pass legislation to expand federal background checks to all gun sales, a measure that I helped to reintroduce here in the Senate and one that is supported by the overwhelming majority of the American people. We can enact reasonable limits on high-capacity magazines and close dangerous loopholes. We can pass red flag laws while still respecting the rights of law-abiding, responsible gun owners. And we can invest in first responders like those who so bravely answered the call at Michigan State. The choice is ours to make. We can honor these young adults by making change, or we can play politics and let this cycle continue. But for Ariel, Alex, and Brian, and for the students and staff at Michigan State, and for every family that has been torn apart by gun violence, we must choose to act. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Thank you, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Raskin for his 5 minutes.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman. The stabilizing braces have evolved significantly from their original intended use, which was allowing disabled gun users to fire an AR-style pistol. Today's braces are largely used to exploit a loophole in the regulatory structure to allow owners to turn their weapons into short-barreled rifles, efficient weapons of war, without triggering traditional ATF oversight of this kind of weapon. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of the people who use these so-called wrist stabilizer braces. Please play the video if you would.
You see a gun like this and you're like, how the heck is a barrel with that length a pistol? Well, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about SB Tactical and their stabilizing braces for pistols.
The end here, which is a rubber type of configuration. It's adjustable if you want to run your arm through it, and do so, you can, and tighten it down to your forearm, which of course is what the braces were originally intended for. However, with the ATF rulings now, you can occasionally accidentally fire from your shoulder.
And today on Sunday Gear Review, I want to talk to you about this SB Tactical HKPDW arm brace. It does help some people, right? So you can slide your arm through that and undo it and all that stuff. But we all know what these are actually used for, and nobody is wondering about that.
And we're going to just see, does it really feel like a stock, even though it's not a stock?
Back to this brace, it changes the game. Like I said, it gives you 4 points of contact with the occasional shoulder. Got it loaded up? Let's see the difference.
Now you've got a very shorty boy, right? So you can put this guy obviously in a briefcase if you wanted to, in a backpack.
Mr. Wilcox, why are short-barreled rifles more dangerous and strictly regulated than other kinds of firearms?
Short-barreled rifles are more easily concealable than long-barreled rifles, but have more destructive power than traditional handguns. For example, common ballistic vests worn by police protect against handgun ammunition, while rifle ammunition, like those fired by short-barrel rifles, can penetrate it.
And what's the difference between a short-barreled rifle and a firearm with a stabilizing brace, as we saw brandished in the video there, and as we see on the poster behind me?
When it comes to usability, I think next to none.
There really is no difference in the power and potential violence of the weapon, and there's very little difference in the weapon's design. Look, our colleagues know that gun violence is the leading cause of death among children in the United States of America today. They know that more people proportionately die of gun violence in America than in any other industrialized country on earth, whether we're talking about Canada or Germany or France, United Kingdom, Japan, Israel, you name it. They know that the states with the highest rates of firearm deaths are the ones with the weakest gun laws, and the states with the lowest levels of firearm deaths have the strongest gun laws. But they say that all of this chaos and destruction is just the necessary price we have to pay because of the Second Amendment. All those thousands of people gunned down at church, in school, at the Walmart, in parks and grocery stores are just the human sacrifice we've decided to pay as a society for our Second Amendment. My colleagues, this is a lie. Our colleagues advance a completely flawed theory of the Second Amendment, which leads them to oppose even reasonable common sense gun safety rules that the Supreme Court has approved and which the vast majority of Americans endorse. Our colleagues embrace what's called the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment. Our colleague, Mr. Gates, says the Second Amendment is, quote, about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government if that becomes necessary. Our colleague, Chip Roy, says the Second Amendment was designed purposefully to empower the people to resist the force of tyranny used against them. And Congresswoman Boebert says the Second Amendment, quote, has nothing to do with hunting unless you're talking about hunting tyrants, maybe. Well, this theory is completely debunked and destroyed by the text of the Constitution itself and by Supreme Court precedent. And yet their theory of the Second Amendment is killing Americans. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union and suppress insurrections and invasions. The Republican Guarantee Clause tells the U.S. Congress to guarantee a Republican form of government to the states and to protect them against domestic violence. There's 6 other provisions in the Constitution, including the Treason Clause, that debunk what they're saying. And we're going to have to get through their false notion of the Second Amendment in order to save human life. Thank you. I yield back.
I now yield to the gentle lady from Texas, Ranking Member Sheila Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the gentlewoman and ranking subcommittee member from Missouri, Congresswoman Bush. Let me acknowledge our chair and from the Oversight Committee and as well chair from Judiciary, and of course the ranking members of the full committees on Oversight, Congressman Raskin, and of course the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler. I thank them for their service and leadership. And I thank Mr. Chairman for convening a hearing that will evidence a very sharp contrast in the issue of saving lives. I do want to acknowledge, in particular, Moms Demand Action and the many other good people of advocates who are wanting to have a reasonable protocol and structure for the owning of guns in America. I call you patriots, and I'm grateful for your presence here today. I call those who sadly and devastatingly are either the family members of victims long gone or who are victims themselves. I thank you for your courage. I acknowledge the witnesses here today, and I hope that they will understand that this democratic process is both a purpose with a purpose, and the purpose, of course, is truth. I'm incredulous that we are holding this hearing. I'm stunned. I'm almost in a sense of pain because we've had over 100 mass shootings only since the beginning of 2023. Constant range of gunfire across America. Sometimes one would think during the week you would be relieved, but it is during the week, it is on the weekend, it's on Friday night, it's on Saturday night, it's on Sunday, when many people in America are seeking the solace of faith. It is in our temples, synagogues, churches. It is in places in the park, schools, hospitals, and beyond. As far back as 1886, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives have been one of this country's most important federal agencies, fulfilling a multifaceted mission to protect American communities from violent crime while keeping us safe through regulation and enforcement of federal laws. Today's ATF's role is more crucial than ever before to help with public safety, as there are more guns in the United States than people. The number one killer for children is homicide, and the tool of the homicide are guns. Precious children, America's future. Fueled by politics and anxieties brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, firearm sales have surged. In 2021, Americans purchased approximately 19 million firearms, down 12.5% from 2020, according to several industry estimates, but 2021 was still the industry's second busiest year on record, while last year was the third busiest. We rely on the ATF to ensure firearms do not end up in the hands of those who should not have them. That's all they do. And to regulate the purchase and transfer of firearms, licensing of firearms, manufacturers and dealers, and innovations within the industry to ensure compliance with federal law, particularly when manufacturers and dealers attempt to circumvent long-standing statutes and regulation. Contrary to what some of my Republican colleagues might say, evidence shows that more guns lead to more shootings. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death among children, as I said, while an average of 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner every month, and every day 316 people on average are shot. Congresswoman Bush's story is real, evident, and it is painful. In an average year, guns account for roughly 2/3 of homicides. However, in 2020, 77% of murders involved firearms. Despite these appalling statistics, congressional Republicans, aided and abetted by extreme rulings from the federal judiciary in favor of possessing and carrying firearms, have allowed our communities to be flooded with the guns of every kind, even in grocery stores and shopping at our major box stores on a Saturday morning. This push to reduce regulation and enforcement, along with the surge in gun sales, has only made communities across the country, rural, urban, and suburban, less safe. Tragically, mass shootings have become an all too common occurrence, and stolen guns, untraceable weapons, firearms purchased in states with fewer restrictions on gun purchases, ghost guns are trafficked through the iron pipeline into states with stiffer laws, boosting their gun-related crimes. It is ironic that yesterday, with the 2-year anniversary of the massacre of 10 people, including a police officer, at the King Soopers supermarket in Boulder, Colorado, and Republicans are here today to attack the ATF and mount a defense of every firearms and modification involved in that shooting. I commend the ATF for their work in identifying a problem and providing guidance to prevent the harm created by the misuse of stabilizing braces, which convert everyday firearms into killing machines. I want to just remind everybody of ghost guns that led a shootout in my city against 3 police officers. I would point out that the ATF performed a similar analysis during the previous administration to create a rule for bump stocks following the mass shooting in Las Vegas that left 60 people dead. In both cases, the firearms and hardware used by the shooters were legally purchased and possessed, but it was evident that something had been done or had to be done after seeing the destruction they caused. And while the vast majority of guns are purchased by law-abiding citizens, there are many ways that legal guns end up in the hands of those who should not have them. And Democrats have never interfered with the purchase of law-abiding citizens under the Second Amendment. And while the vast majority of guns are purchased, the reporting from ATF indicates that more than 1 million guns were stolen from private citizens in the 5-year period from 2017 to 2021. That number is very likely much higher, since there is no law that requires gun owners to report theft or loss of firearm. Again, ironically, Republicans have attacked the very database that ATF maintains to track weapons and solve problems. The ATF has taken affirmative steps to prevent future violence, using technology to get violent criminals off the streets. In 2016, ATF created a crime gun intelligence center launched as an interagency collaboration designed to collect, analyze, and distribute intelligence data about crime, guns, mass shootings, and major incidents across multiple jurisdictions. The 25 CGICs strategically located. Mr. Chairman, as I close, I would like to finish this last paragraph. Through their work, more than 616,000 investigative leads were generated by CGIs in 2020, and 490,800 crimes were traced back to their origins. In my home state and in Houston Police Department and other local agencies joined the ATF Crime Gun Strike Force. Finally, that is why Democrats passed several additional pieces of legislation last Congress to ban assault weapons, bump stocks, ghost guns, and high-capacity magazines, encourage safe firearms storage practices, raise the age at which semi-automatic rifles can be purchased, pass a huge amount for violence intervention, and to keep firearms out of the hands of prohibited persons. Democrats will continue to promote responsible firearm ownership through common-sense laws that keep Americans safe and support the efforts of the ATF to enforce those laws. I don't know about anyone else here, Mr. Chairman. I believe in saving the lives of our babies and our fellow Americans. I yield back.
Continues to take the lives of more than 100 Americans every single day. It changes how safe we feel in our schools and in our houses of worship. It reduces vibrant cities to somber headlines. It takes our loved ones, old and young, and leaves us with another anniversary of lives cut short and a community forever changed. 3 weeks ago, 6 more people, including 3 children, were killed in a mass shooting at a school in Nashville. It was the 19th school shooting just this year. 3 weeks ago, 3 more families woke up without the child that they took to school the day before. 6 more families faced the unthinkable, that their son, their daughter, their parent, their husband, their wife, or their sibling are one of the 100 Americans we lose every day to gun violence. And Mr. Chairman, the United States is the only nation on the face of the earth which has these systematic mass shootings. And 3 weeks ago, the majority had planned to mark up this very legislation, a bill to make stabilizing braces widely available without a background check, even though they'd already been used in mass shootings in Dayton, Boulder, and Colorado Springs. When it was revealed that the shooter in Nashville also used the gun with a stabilizing brace, the Republicans canceled the markup. Until now. Today, the majority has decided that enough time has passed and 6 lives were lost in yet another mass shooting with a stabilizing brace. Perhaps they think that we have forgotten the lives lost in that terrible tragedy. But we will never forget them, or the countless others who lose their lives to gun violence every day. Today, rather than stand up against gun violence, the majority has called this markup so that they can yet again stand with the gun industry. Rather than support the law enforcement officers who are on the front lines of protecting our communities, the majority is attempting to weaken law enforcement by rolling back a rule created by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives meant to protect us from dangerous weapons. ATF is the law enforcement agency tasked with keeping guns out of the wrong hands and keeping our gun laws in line with congressional intent through rulemaking. In 1934, Congress passed the National Firearms Act, creating additional requirements to own certain especially dangerous firearms like short-barreled rifles, which were widely used by violent criminals. Congress included short-barreled rifles because they combine the firepower of a rifle with the concealability of a smaller gun. But in recent years, the gun industry discovered a way to circumvent the restrictions of the National Firearms Act by selling stabilizing braces, an accessory that allows a pistol to be fired from the shoulder, turning it into a deadly yet concealable short-barreled rifle. In 2020, under the Trump administration, the ATF concluded that stabilizing braces were being widely used to create short-barreled rifles and to publish guidance regarding their use. But House Republicans cried foul. Just 4 days after the guidance was published, 90 House Republicans sent a letter to ATF and DOJ expressing their opposition. And just a few days later, the guidance was withdrawn. A few months later, under the Biden administration, the ATF revived its efforts to regulate stabilizing braces and published the final rule in January to ensure that our laws stay in line with the intent of Congress dating all the way back to 1934, when Congress decided that deadly, concealable short-barreled rifles should be subject to heightened regulation. But Republicans will stop at nothing to block the ATF from taking this simple life-saving measure. Mass shooters used guns with stabilizing braces to kill 9 people outside a bar in Dayton in 2019, to kill 10 people, including a responding police officer at a grocery store in Boulder in 2021, to kill 5 people in an LGBTQ nightclub in Colorado Springs in 2022, and to kill 6 people at a school in Nashville just 3 weeks ago. How many more people have to die before Republicans acknowledge that these weapons are a favorite of mass shooters for their ability to make a gun both deadly and concealable? How many more people have to die before Republicans will value the lives of our children over the profits of the gun industry? Last Congress, Democrats put forth a range of solutions to prevent gun violence, to support law enforcement, and to solve violent crimes. But our colleagues across the aisle continue to push for unfettered access to every firearm and accessory imaginable. As Republicans continue to seek freedom from gun regulation, we will continue to see communities free from gun violence. I urge my colleagues to oppose this dangerous legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Who seeks gentleman from Kentucky is recognized. Mr. Massey.
Yielded 2 minutes and is recognized.
The GOP, it's become, sadly, the guns over people party. Its answer to the desperate pleas of families from all across America who want to stop the slaughter of school children and other innocents. Their answer? Do absolutely nothing. But today, during this National Gun Violence Awareness Month, what do? They go a step further. This is the only opportunity this year that Speaker McCarthy has permitted us to consider any gun violence legislation. And what do they do about gun violence? They enable a little more of it. More pistol braces in the hands of killers will cause us to brace for more death. Republicans want to stop an ATF rule that will require background checks in certain narrow instances when a brace turns a handgun into a rifle. Well, background checks are exactly what we need for all gun purchases, so that those who go through the gun shop loophole and don't get a check when they buy it at a gun show or on the internet have to have the same standard as if they bought it in a gun shop. They will not even permit us to respond to the desperate pleas of the people of Uvalde to ban weapons of war from the hands of teenagers who couldn't on their own go out and buy a beer. There is an orgy of violence going on, and they are obstructing those of us who want to respond to the pleas from doing anything about it, from banning weapons of war, from requiring background checks to ensure we know what kind of person is getting a gun, and if they have a problem, they ought to be denied that access. The gun industry is marketing these so-called stabilizing braces to convert heavy pistols into sharp-barreled rifles that are more concealable. May I have another 30 seconds?
I yield a gentleman additional 30 seconds.
Guns are already the #1 killer of children in our country. There have been, this year, 291 mass shootings. We can count the numbers, but we can't count the pain of an empty chair where there was once a vibrant parent or a wonderful little child who is murdered in a mass shooting. This Congress could do something about it if we could end the obstruction. We need to move toward reducing gun violence, not to enabling it. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is.
How much time does that may consume?
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman says that the cause of gun violence in this country is homicidal maniacs. We have 78 times as much gun violence per unit of population than any other country in the world. Does the gentleman think that we are 78 times as mentally ill, that we have 78 times as many gun maniacs in this country as anywhere else per unit of population? That's a slander on the American people. The obvious cause is we have guns run amok. Mr. Speaker, Republicans have claimed this rule affects forearm braces. It does not. If a disabled veteran needs a forearm brace to shoot a pistol, he or she can still get one without registering it. The only firearms affected by this rule are those that have a brace that is, quote, designed, made, and intended to be fired from the shoulder, close quote. And if a veteran or anyone else wants a covered brace, all they have to do is register it. It was even free to do so until June 1st. The ATF waived the fee to encourage compliance. All this rule does is close a loophole so that all short-barreled rifles are subject to the common sense requirements of the National Firearms Act, registration and a background check. I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Next up is Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Robinson, your testimony is really powerful on the issue not only of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, but also the threats of violence and hate crimes. And you describe this entire emergency as a result of a coordinated moral panic. The reference to this emergency is unprecedented in the 50 years of the Human Rights Campaign, which itself is noteworthy. I wonder if you could describe the links here that make it coordinated, that create the threat of violence, the feeling that this community is, to quote you, constantly under threat, and what relation it is to gun violence in particular at Pulse and Club Q. You refer to both of those. If you could just expound on your testimony a little bit in that regard.
Absolutely. And I think that, those real-life examples of Pulse and Club Q show that this violent political rhetoric plus easy access to firearms equals real-life harm, violence, death to my community. And while we're here talking about the issues that are truly affecting children, their health and their safety, The number one thing we should be talking about is gun violence. That is the number one killer of America's youth, but instead we are putting a target on the backs of trans kids. And when it comes to where this is coming from, we don't have to guess. I mean, the American Principles Project, their executive director said that they are targeting trans kids to, quote, score political points. And every time we see these waves of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation move through states, over 500 bills just this year, we see it accompanied by campaigns of hate and bias online. In Florida, when the Don't Say Gay or Trans bill was moving through, you saw a 400% increase in language of groomers online targeting the LGBTQ plus community. Let's be clear that this is instilling fear in people. This is perpetuating transphobia and homophobia that has real-life impact on harm on the lives of my community.
Would you say that a lot of the rhetoric, the legislation, in a sense, gives license to the violence or encourages it implicitly, maybe without directly intending it, but nonetheless creates an atmosphere where the violence is more likely to flourish?
Absolutely. You know, there was a speaker at CPAC that called for the quote-unquote eradication of transgender. That sort of violent language takes away the humanity of people that look like me, the people who experience the world like me, LGBTQ plus people across this country. It makes us seem less human. When you couple that with trying to censor education, remove our stories from schools, trying to criminalize or vilify loving parents for affirming their gender identity, this is creating a culture of fear and harm that's directly targeted at some of our most vulnerable, the LGBTQ plus community and trans youth. We should all see what's happening for the moral crisis that it is and know that because the attack is coming to trans youth today doesn't mean that that target can't be placed on someone else's back next week. This is a threat not only for the trans community, but for us all.
I think that's a really important point, that we are all at risk of this violence if the LGBTQ plus community can be targeted in this way. Anyone can be targeted. Anyone who's different is at risk. And this community right now is the most vulnerable, but others can be targeted as well. Senator Hirono and I have helped to lead hate crimes legislation, which actually has taken as one of its principal causes to stop exactly this kind of violence. And so I want to thank you for your leadership and look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Speaker, in this week to stop gun violence, it is important to remind all of you that 4.6 million minors live with guns in the home, many of those unstored. And every year, almost 20,000 children are shot and killed or wounded by firearms. In fact, homicide is now the #1 killer of children. Kimberly Vaughn, a young innocent of 14 years old with a wonderful mother who served in the military, was killed in 2018 when a 17-year-old student went on a shooting spree. Those guns were left in the home. I introduced the Kimberly Vaughn Safe Storage Act. I asked my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, to join me because it asked the Attorney General to give best practices, voluntary, related to safe firearm storage, publish them on a website. Labeling, simply label and say, please store your guns. When you go and buy it at a retailer store, to give the devices to make sure that you have those storage locks, if you could. Provide grants to states and local governments for a 10-year, $10 million grant program for local government nonprofit to distribute safe storage devices. No burden to you whatsoever. And then, of course, to give you a tax credit for doing so.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Republicans and Democrats, join us. Save lives, save the children's lives, stop gun violence, the Kimberly Vaughn Storage Act.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to recognize the life and service of Dr. Orrin Allen. Throughout his life, Dr. Allen was committed to advancing justice and serving his community. He worked for the Contra Costa County Probation Department in California for 35 years and was especially passionate about supporting our youth, serving on several local boards In 1999, Dr. Allen was named Contra Costa County's Humanitarian of the Year in recognition of his commitment to the county's youth. Dr. Allen also worked tirelessly to ensure quality education and supported students. He served as an elected member on the Pittsburgh, California Unified School District Board for more than 20 years and was recognized for his contributions with an Outstanding Friend of Education Award from the Association of California School Administrators. Outside of his professional pursuits, Dr. Allen enjoyed spending time with his family and friends, of which I am one and consider myself lucky to have been his friend. Sadly, Dr. Allen passed away on April 23rd. He will be remembered for his compassionate nature and his many contributions to our community. Please join me in recognizing the life of Dr. Orrin Allen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Minute.
Yes.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most of you have probably never heard of Cedar Hill, Texas, but you know their story. A gunman walks into a hospital, which should be a place of healing, and instead inflicts immeasurable pain and trauma. That is the story of Cedar Hill on July 25th, 2023. A terrifying day for my constituents, but an ordinary day for America, at least the America of today, where guns are gods and people are pawns. The America where the gun lobby wins and we, the people, lose. People lose their lives. They lose a sense of sanity, and we all lose a sense of security. Make no mistake, when the radical right wins, we, the people, lose our rights. They have no clue what it means to be truly pro-life. If they did, they'd write or at least support legislation that meets the moment, a moment full of death and destruction that is crying out for solutions and sanity. And with that, I will yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to press the House for 1 minute and revise.
Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. And now I'll yield to Mr. Kassar from Texas for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I really appreciate the Oversight Committee hosting today's hearing because we've had 35,000 people killed by gun violence this year alone. And instead of having hearings on critical issues like this, we've unfortunately been often pushed into hearings about Twitter or about the DC City Council instead of about how do we prevent the deaths of hundreds of children by passing common sense gun safety legislation. My district in the heart of Texas is a very short drive from Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, where we're still mourning 19 children, 2 teachers, and a whole community devastated by the killing there by a horrible shooter with an assault weapon and a weapon of war. And bulletproof doors and giving guns to teachers cannot be the solution because we've seen from the data that that has not solved the problem. We need to reinstate the assault weapons ban. We need to raise the age for buy a gun. We need those universal background checks. And even though after the killings in Uvalde and in Texas and across the country, Democrats in Congress came together to pass important legislation, so much of that legislation would not have prevented what happened in Uvalde. And in my time here in Congress, I've seen that the money, the corporate gun lobby has been what has held so much of this legislation back. One estimate shows that the NRA has donated more than $140 million to corporate gun lobby candidates since 2010. And we need to continue to have that conversation so that the American people can finally push this Congress to overcome that sort of money, because if a shooter is determined to hurt innocent people and they're a dangerous person, and we continue to have these guns anywhere for everybody all the time without a license, open carried in places like Texas, we know that the killing is only going to get worse. And so I so appreciate the Oversight Democrats hosting this roundtable and each of you for your testimony and advocacy. Ms. Kefford, I just can't imagine the continued pain in your community and after what it is that students and teachers and community members experienced at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Can you Can you tell us what you think? Oftentimes we hear from politicians that giving teachers guns would have stopped mass shootings. Do you think that would have stopped the mass shooting from occurring at your school?
I don't think giving more people guns would have stopped that shooting. Certainly, police responded to that tragedy, that horrible tragedy, with their weapons. Unfortunately, lives were already lost. There is a need for mental health resources. There is a need for people in schools. Almost every child in this country goes to school, right? Who sees those children more than probably their parents do, their teachers, staff at schools. Having resources in place for early warning signs, for identifying when there's an issue, for providing that support is absolutely critical. Not always is it going to solve the problem to have those resources in place after. We need to have those resources all along, right? Before tragedies and after tragedies. And I think making sure that there is funding for that in place is absolutely 100% critical. I also think from a safety perspective, having a trained school resource officer who has specific training and experience working with adolescents, working in schools is critical to, number one, foster that relationship and ensure that there's safety in that school. Mr. Timpson spoke about that just a few minutes ago, about that relationship piece and having that exposure of young people to law enforcement and how important bridging that relationship is.
Thank you. And Professor Blucher, when the Second Amendment was drafted, do you think the Founding Fathers anticipated tens of thousands of innocent Americans being killed by gun violence every year?
I'm quite confident they did not. I'm also confident that the guns with which they were familiar were black powder muskets, which, having fired one, I can tell you takes about a minute to load and frequently misfires. There's no possible way they could have conceived of a situation like what transpired at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, or for that matter in Lewiston, or for that matter at any of the other place names which we all know, unfortunately, all too well.
I appreciate the clarity of your remarks. I appreciate us bringing folks together to have oversight on this critical issue. Look at how it is we can save thousands of lives every year and have oversight over the corporate gun lobby and the amount of money that they put into the system that keeps us from taking on reasonable solutions that are constitutional, that are up to date, and that are just the baseline response to the gun violence, both mass shootings and everyday killings that we see in our community. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Cassar. And
next to my very good friend, distinguished alum of this committee, Mr. Raskin, for any testimony about any amendment you care to make.
Chairman Cole, thank you very kindly. It's an honor to be here with my former colleagues from the Rules Committee, and I want to encourage you guys to keep going. I know it's been a tough few months here, but we're indebted to you for your hard work. I want to talk primarily about Amendment 182. We have 78,000 licensed gun dealers in America, which is more than the number of McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger Kings, and Subways combined, 78,000. And the vast majority of them are law-abiding and are trying to do the right thing. Only 5% of the gun dealers in America are the source of more than 90% of the firearms that are recovered from crimes. And I'm offering an amendment today to make sure that the tiny minority of bad apple firearms dealers who deal a hugely disproportionate number of firearms into the criminal underground and are linked to crimes will stop getting federal contracts. Now, what kind of federal contracts are we talking about? Well, the ATF, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice, the FBI all purchase firearms from private dealers. So what I want to say is that if you are on the tiny list that is kept of the bad or rotten apple gun dealers in the so-called Demand 2 program, that you should not be able to get a contract to sell weapons to the federal government. Now, Demand 2 plays a critical role in ensuring that federal, local, and state law enforcement agencies are able to solve gun crimes. The National Training Center, the NTC, which is part of the ATF, is the center, the only center that establishes the chain of custody of firearms recovered in crimes. And they do that by linking the importer or manufacturer to the first retail purchaser, creating links between a criminal suspect and a recovered firearm. And the NTC relies on law enforcement agencies to submit to them traces in bona fide criminal investigations. Well, decades ago, ATF found that it had become nearly impossible to trace firearms that had been resold. And they took the most reasonable step imaginable to make sure that they could trace these guns. They created a program that would require dealers with a very high number of firearms traced to them with a short time to crime ratio, which is the time between the sale of the firearm and the recovery of the firearm by law enforcement, to report whenever they're acquiring used guns from non-licensees. Okay, and this program has been a smashing, unmitigated success. In ATF's most recent trafficking assessment, more than 190,000 guns used in crimes whose acquisitions had been reported from that 3% of the firearm dealers subject to the Demand 2 program had been traced. So that program is working. And the threshold has changed several times over its history, most recently in 2018, when the Trump administration raised the threshold from 10 guns that had to have had a short time to crime ratio within 3 years to 25 or more guns traced in a calendar year with a time to crime of less than 3 years. So, just to give you a bit of counterpoint context, the overwhelming majority of gun dealers in America, more than 85%, have 0 guns traced to them in a calendar year. So we're talking about a very tiny slice that end up on this list. So, why would we be spending taxpayer money through DOJ or Treasury or ATF to purchase guns from this tiny slice of the firearm dealers in America who fail to do what they need to do, but rather appear to be a magnet for the criminal element? That I heard some discussion before about undocumented people, illegal people coming to the country, purchasing guns. A lot of these gun sales are going to precisely the people who Mr. Norman was talking about when he was here. In any event, the blood that's on the hands of this tiny percentage of bad apple gun dealers should not be on our hands too. And I really hope that the committee will see fit to bring this amendment up. And I also wanted to say a word quickly about 2 amendments to strike provisions in the bill that are going to make it a lot easier for gun buyers to circumvent the law and turn pistols into concealable assault rifles. In January, DOJ published a new rule to restrict guns with an accessory known as a stabilizing brace, which transforms handguns into a weapon that is very powerful and very easy to conceal. Now, for some reason, there's not 1, but 2 separate provisions in this legislation to defund implementation and enforcement of the Justice Department rule. These provisions try to prevent ATF from enforcing the oldest federal firearms law in the country, one that's been on the books for nearly a century. All the rule did is to provide clarity to gun owners in the industry. If you put a device that objectively transforms a pistol into a short-barreled rifle or sawed-off shotgun, regardless of what you call it, a stabilizing brace or something else, those firearms are covered under the National Firearm Act. And so these amendments would reverse the amendments that are trying to make it easier for people to circumvent federal law. Firearms equipped with the so-called stabilizing braces have been used in several targeted mass murders recently with devastating consequences. In Dayton, Ohio, 9 people were killed, 27 injured outside a bar in 32 seconds, Mr. Chairman. In Boulder, Colorado, 10 people were killed in a couple of minutes at a grocery store. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, 5 were killed and 25 injured at Club Q. And in Nashville, Tennessee, just a few months ago, 6 people, 3 of whom were only 9 years old, were killed at a school, all with these stabilizing braces. So I want to speak very strongly for Amendments 178 and 179 that would bring proper regulation back to the field. I yield back and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to my friend, Mr. Klein, for comments on any amendments he cares to address.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the committee for its hard work on this important legislation. I'm a member of the CJS subcommittee, so I normally would not be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that I heard my colleague, Senator Cornish, say that we have a shared goal, and I would say that our shared goal is to decrease gun violence in our country, the number one killer of young people in our country. And how do we do that? One of the ways is to, I suppose, lock up the violent criminals, although I'm not so sure that that's what we're doing, that our prisons are populated, have been populated for a long time with maybe not violent, nonviolent drug cases. Be that as it may, for Dr. Ramey, you've worked in this area. Are there other things that Congress can do to decrease the easy access to guns, which results in the deaths of our young people?
One of the biggest things, which I know was partly addressed in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, is around domestic violence and domestic violence restraining orders. We know that if a perpetrator of domestic violence has access to a gun, you see a 500% increase in the risk of the victim being killed by that gun. We know that most murder-suicides are partner violence, most mass shootings are domestic violence related, and domestic violence is a leading cause of pregnancy death. We also know that states with limits on firearm access by people under a domestic violence restraining order have a significant decrease in firearm partner violence. So that's a significant thing that Congress can do. Extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws are also, the data suggests, tremendously effective in decreasing suicide death in particular, and there's some anecdotal evidence that they may help in reducing mass shooting deaths. And then lastly, of course, data and accurate assessments of whether or not these things work matter deeply. The American public deserves us to spend money and legislation on programs that work, and funding both data and research helps with that enterprise.
Thank you for noting that domestic violence situations are among the worst things leading to gun violence, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Fifth Circuit case based on Bruin, where in a domestic violence situation, the Fifth Circuit tossed out the use of a gun because of a person who was under a domestic violence order, I think. Anyway, this case is before the Supreme Court. What are your concerns about if the court sustains the Fifth Circuit in terms of the ability of the federal government or anybody else to limit gun accessibility from people who have domestic violence orders?
So there's two sides to this. One is the personal. I've taken care of multiple victims of domestic violence shootings, and they are, like those firearm suicides, just horrifying. They almost never come out of the blue. Folks know before they happen that they are at risk. I lost a colleague, a fellow emergency physician in 2018, who was shot and killed as she walked out of a shift at a Chicago hospital by her ex-fiancé. So this is something that has tremendous personal resonance to me. The other side of it is that domestic violence is one of those very well-established risk factors for violence against self and others. Again, not just against the partner, but also against children, family members, and society at large. And so there is tremendous concern on the part of the health and public health community that should that Rahimi case be decided to overturn the prohibitions on firearm ownership by folks with a history of conviction of domestic violence, that it will have tremendous negative downstream effects for Americans in general in terms of the number and severity of firearm injuries.
And you are referring to the Romina case, which is before the Supreme Court. Thank you for making the connection between domestic violence situations and gun violence. But the Bruin decision is leading to unexpected consequences, I would say, and in many criminal proceedings, the criminals or the people who are being tried are using the Bruin decision for the proposition that they cannot be prevented from owning a gun. So the Bruin decision is going to continue to create a lot of questions. In fact, in Hawaii, for example, we have some of the strictest gun laws, and many of these laws are being challenged under the Bruin decision. So I think that the Bruin decision is one that I think Congress should look at. I realize that that decision is based on a constitutional right to bear arms, but it is not an unfettered right, and I think that there is probably more that we can do to limit the impact of the Bruin decision. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Kennedy.
Member of the Subcommittee on Crime, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy to be able to welcome the witnesses here and listen to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and really find no reason for us to be here today because none of us should be in disagreement of empowering women and choosing the basis of the empowerment that they would utilize to be safe. I think it is important for women to be empowered. We need to respect the individual rights while also addressing the urgent need for responsible regulation, a concept that is very clear prior to the politicization of the Supreme Court of the United States. We can do both. For obvious reasons, I've been a strong proponent of women's empowerment. And if there are women who feel empowered by responsible, safe firearm ownership, that is certainly their prerogative, and I respect their decision. On the other hand, women who have a different perspective should also be safe with the kinds of gun laws that will provide them safety, common sense gun laws. And certainly in a domestic violence situation, their abusers should not have a gun to be able to use against them. I can never talk about this issue without mentioning Sergeant Preston in Houston, Texas, who enforces in his life, he is now deceased, that the domestic violence calls are some of the most dangerous calls that are ever made. And he lost his life protecting a mother and son. They lived, but he died answering a domestic violence call. And I always want to pay tribute to Sergeant Preston. I also want to put into the record, Mr. Chairman, before amicus brief led by the House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, signed by 151 representatives and 18 senators, filed in U.S. versus Rabini, and just take one quote that I think is important. The only difference between a battered woman and a dead woman is the presence of a gun. So we know
Without
that.
objection.
I thank you. We know that we have to be safe when we talk about gun use. And let me put into the record as well some statistics that are important as I begin to ask my questions. Just having access to a firearm makes an abuser 5 times more likely to take their partner's life. Over the last decade, gun homicides by intimate partners jumped 58%, and the pandemic was an especially lethal period for abuse victims. Gun homicides involving intimate partners rose a stunning 25% in 2020, compared with the previous year to the highest level in almost 3 decades. And in that year, women accounted for more than 2/3 of the victims shot and killed by intimate partners. In 2021, researchers reported that more than 2/3 of recent mass shootings were involved with perpetrators who killed partners or relatives or had a history of domestic abuse. So we have to find a balance here. And so my first question I want to ask all of you is gun storage a good common ground that we all can support? Storing one's guns. Ms. Solomon?
I believe we all can agree that guns should be stored when not in use.
Ms. Watrell?
And
But I also believe, I agree with Ms. Solomon, but I also believe they have to be accessible. If I am going to have a firearm in my home.
But you believe that
myself,
storage is good. Thank you. Ms. Glenn
Absolutely.
and Ms. Alcatraz, we know they have to be accessible, but you have children, so do you believe in good storage structure?
Storage is only part of the education and training that we would do for
But
our
it is
families.
included in it. I appreciate
Only
your
part.
response. Let me also indicate that I have a letter from the Jewish Women International I'd like to ask submitted into the record.
Without objection.
Okay, and I'd like to also acknowledge the Moms Demand Action for your leadership. And I think what I'd like to conclude on is I believe in empowering women. I believe any hearing that would suggest that any difference between protecting domestic violence victims is untoward and incorrect. I do want to leave a topic that is somewhat related about empowering women, and I have paid tribute to her and acknowledged her, and that is the horrific reproductive rights legislation that we have in Texas that has allowed an innocent mother of 31 years old to actually flee our state to be able to save her life and to be able to have additional children, and that is Kate Cox. So when we talk about empowering women, we need to talk about all issues. Ms. Glenn, I'm very pleased to see your leadership on these issues, but I want to make sure that your leadership is not diminished. You want to train women, but you want to make sure that people know that a gun can be very detrimental. And I guess as I close, so can detrimental reproductive denial that would allow a young woman or force her to flee and to prosecute innocent medical providers who are simply trying to save lives. We should not prosecute anyone for trying to save lives. With that, I yield back.